Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Tucker Carlson Tonight program. I'm Tammy Bruce, filling in for Tucker this evening. President Trump surprised U.S. troops in Iraq with a holiday visit today, his first visit to the United States troops serving in a combat zone. While there, the president briefly touched on domestic politics, saying a government shutdown will only end with money for a border wall.
How long do you think the shutdown will last, Mr. President?
Whatever it takes. I mean, we're going to have a wall. We're going to have safety. We need safety for our country.
All righty, Mike Emanuel is in Washington with more. Mike.
Tammy, good evening. President Trump went to see the troops in a combat zone at a time when he's made significant decisions about American foreign policy. And there's also a shakeup of some of his senior leadership. The president and first lady left late Christmas night under tight security to visit American forces serving in Iraq at Christmas time. Some of his message was clearly to wish those men and women a Merry Christmas and to thank them for their dedicated service. While the president has announced plans to withdraw troops from nearby Syria, he says he plans to keep them in Iraq, where they could still launch strikes against ISIS.
When I became president, they were a very dominant group. They were very dominant. Today, they're not so dominant anymore. Great job.
The president had taken some heat from the media, noting he was the first commander-in-chief to not visit the troops in 15 years. Then he landed at Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq today, likely neutralizing that attack. The commander-in-chief's first visit to a combat zone was with the First Lady and gave him a chance to hear directly from commanders on the ground. And the president noted the remarkable job U.S. forces have done taking the fight to the Islamic State terror group.
With the near elimination of the ISIS territorial caliphate in Iraq and in Syria.
The timing of the trip comes as the Secretary of Defense and the Special Envoy for the coalition to defeat ISIS have both resigned. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis is out at the end of the year after being critical of the president's foreign policy. And Brett McGurk was planning to leave in early 2019, but turned in his resignation in protest of the president's plan to pull U.S. forces out of Syria. The president invited the Iraqi prime minister to the White House next year, and we're told he accepted the invitation. I should note Air Force One has touched down in Germany for a refueling stop where the commander-in-chief is meeting with more U.S. military personnel. Tammy?
Great, Mike. Thank you. And I think you'd agree with the sound of that crowd out there that having a visit from the commander-in-chief sure is a lifter of morale. It seems like it went very well.
No doubt about it. At Christmas time, it's great to hear from the boss.
Indeed. All right, Mike, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tammy.
When the president returns to Washington, he'll be coming back to a city still sharply divided over his proposed border wall. The government remains in partial shutdown, as Trump says he will not sign funding legislation until he receives money to begin a wall on the Mexican border. Democrats continue to howl with rage against the president.
No Democrat has called for shutting the government down. We are all working to avoid it. The president seems to relish it.
It's a governing crisis. We better face the reality. This is a dangerous time. This is not just another government shutdown.
Donald Trump is on track to be the worst president in modern times, and perhaps ever. The days of waiting for this president to change how he operates, and the days of hoping that he can somehow achieve more and do better, those days are behind us.
But let me just say this. The president, he's unraveled. Things are unraveling. Would you prefer chaos? It's chaotic.
This shutdown is on the president because he has caused such division, he can't even broker a deal on a side issue like this.
All righty. Trump, meanwhile, says the shutdown is squarely the fault of Democrats in their refusal to ever secure the border with Mexico.
I can't tell you when the government's going to be open. I can tell you it's not going to be open until we have a wall, a fence, whatever they'd like to call it. I'll call it whatever they want. The people of this country want border security. You know, it's not a question of me. I'd rather not be doing shutdowns. These federal workers want the wall. The only one that doesn't want the wall are the Democrats because they don't mind open borders. The only time they went against it, there was only one time when Donald Trump said we want to build the wall. As soon as I said I want to build the wall, they were all against it.
All righty. Well, Dan Bongino is a former Secret Service agent and the author of Spygate, the attempted sabotage of Donald J. Trump. Robin Biro is a former regional campaign director for Barack Obama. They both join us now. Welcome aboard, you guys. Thanks for joining me.
Good to be here.
Thank you so much.
So look, Dan, I've got to say to you, it's funny to watch, of course, the Democrats, the doom and gloom. I mean, we've just moved through the Christmas holiday. The sky is falling. We're looking for grubs and puddle water to eat and drink, through the shutdown. Do you think that this kind of complaint is really changing the point of view of the American people about what's really happening in Washington and what matters when it comes to national security versus a negotiation to get what we need for that border wall?
No, I don't think the media is changing one mind out there, Tammy, but for a very specific reason. Listen, chaos is not a brand, okay? It's not a brand you want to run. Even Richard Nixon figured that out, running on a Law and Order platform of all people, right? Nixon figured that out. Chaos is not a brand. Well, I say that because the Democrats haven't offered anything of substance outside of cheap rhetoric about actually supporting border security. There's just a terrific segment with Steve Miller on another network confronting a media figure about this specifically. What have the Democrats done to secure the border? And you know what the answer is? Let's go to the next segment, because they just don't have anything.
Well, Dan, I see Robin's head nodding over there.
Yes.
But really,
you know it.
There's the Democrats argue that there is border security and then there is the border wall. And yet we know, Robin, that where there are wall sections, the illegal traffic goes down over 90%. So historically, we know this works. We know it works in this country. I think all three of us can agree. We want this chaos to end. It's not good for the country.
Yes.
It's not good for the migrants. It's not good for the American citizens. So what exactly is going on that the Democrats think is working so well, considering the chaos that's occurring right now?
We've got several problems, and let's call out the hypocrisy from my own party, because in 2006 we did support the Secure Fence Act, which erected more than 700 miles of border on our southeast border. So we've got to own that, and I think the president would be very wise to pitch this not as a wall, but as expanding what we already agreed to on a bipartisan measure when senators at the time, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, both voted for this. I think that would be a great way for him to pitch this as a fence, as you've heard his language changing.
Yeah, he said
recently.
he would call it whatever they want him to call it. And Robin, though, isn't that kind of somewhat juvenile that you want to change the name of something and yet the action would be the same? Because you're right, the Secure Fences Act, the construction that already occurred is the thing that is helping us. Why are they suddenly against it now? Is it really just politics and because it's campaigning? Is that what it is? I'm not going to give you any BS. The reason that they're doing this is because of optics. Each side, you're smart, and you know that each side has got to find a way to save face with their base. So right now, by pitching this as a fence, that allows my party a chance to save face and say, hey, we can't give you a fortified concrete wall, but we can give you a funding for a fence as long as... Now, Dick Durbin made a great point on the networks on Sunday by saying that only 1 out of every 5 vehicles coming across the border are being screened right now. So what he'd like to see is more funding for that in addition to funding for a fence. I think that we've got some inroads here. I honestly do believe there is a way ahead. It's just got to be in a way that we both can pitch it to our fence, to our bases. That becomes, Dan, the question is, how far does the president go? Does he never sign a bill until he gets... Look, he's compromising. They're already talking about $2.5 billion. The president is a master negotiator. He knows that they're going to find some place in the middle, unless the Democrats just genuinely don't care. How far does the president take this, Dan?
Well, the president's a deal maker. He's built buildings in New York, where I grew up, the toughest place on earth to do business. And I got to tell you, it's rare that I'm on debating a Democrat on the network, but Robin's right. There's going to have to be some face-saving measures on both sides. Both of us would be naive, all three of us, to say that. I think if you want to call it a fence, if you want to call it a wall, as long as it's an obstacle that will prevent the illegal flow of people across our border, I think the American people will be fine with that. One more more thing, Tammy. The Border Patrol people I talk to as well don't seem to mind the idea of slats because they can see through it on the other side.
Sure.
It's a deterrent. It's an obstacle. The American people want border security. If it allows Democrats to save some kind of face but stops illegal immigration, not in its tracks, and nothing's going to stop it completely, but puts an obstacle in front of it, then I think that's fine, and I think everybody walks away
happy. We know the
happy.
Democrats understand that because the preface before always saying they don't want the wall is that they care about border security. So Democrats, Americans who happen to be Democrats, they care about their families as well. They care about the nature of what's happening at the border now. Democrats, none of us want to hear stories about children dying in the midst of a trek that should never have happened in the first place. These are the things that unite us, and I think that this is where we can have a good conversation. The president knows it, and hopefully these games will end. But the president's position is based, of course, in a national security framework for all of these individuals, not just American citizens, Robin, you would agree, but for the individuals making these 1,000-mile treks with their children. No one should be accepting this environment as being acceptable or something that should be encouraged. We really need to have a system that stops that. You would agree?
Absolutely. And we need comprehensive immigration reform. And I want to clearly say that my party can absolutely not afford to be labeled as the party that embraces open borders, which is why we're trying to say there are other things that we need in addition to, at least at the minimum,
Robin,
a stronger fence.
Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, all they've been saying is he's never going to get the wall. He's never going to get it. They seem to be doubling down on an argument that this is the problem with liberals often, perhaps not you, but liberals a great deal, that they don't know when to stop. They misjudge the Kavanaugh dynamic. They're misjudging this, I contend.
Oh, yes.
And we need, the American people want solutions. This is what they're looking for. President Trump is a man of action. He's been consistent in his positions. You started this segment talking about how Democrats had voted for the Secure Fences Act. They have not been consistent. Why should we trust what the Democrats do once they take over the House of Representatives as being either believable or truthful?
Great question. And, you know, I will just point out that on both sides, there are calm heads. There are also crazy people on both sides of the aisle. Those are the ones that get the most airtime in the media, unfortunately. But there are smart people like Dick Durbin who get it, who say that there are multilateral approaches
really,
that we can
Robin,
take
you were
to
so
this.
good. You were so good until you said Dick Durbin and the word smart in the same sentence. I just got a headache. All right, you guys, this is a great conversation. Dan, Robin, terrific. I really appreciate it. Thanks. Have a great night. Merry Christmas.
Absolutely.
Look, for several days now, ICE has been releasing hundreds of migrant asylum seekers into a public park in El Paso, Texas, with apparently no plan for taking care of them. Fox chief correspondent Jonathan Hunt joins us now with more.
Good evening, Tammy. In all, several hundred migrants were released in El Paso, Texas from the weekend to Christmas Day without ICE apparently giving the usual advance notice to shelters and other groups that offer help to the migrants. Democratic Congressman Beto O'Rourke was among those greeting the migrants as they mulled their next move on Christmas Day.
ICE admitted that they dropped the ball, that they made a mistake yesterday by not giving the community any kind of heads up on releasing 214 migrants at the Greyhound bus station last night and early this morning.
And activists who usually coordinate with ICE were also caught unawares.
We're a little perplexed because this is not something that ICE typically does.
In a statement, ICE blamed, quote, decades of inaction by Congress for limiting its ability to detain and promptly remove families in the United States illegally, and went on, quote, to mitigate the risk of holding family units past the time frame allotted to the government, ICE has curtailed reviews of post-release plans from families apprehended along the southwest border. That statement obviously doesn't directly address the situation in El Paso over the last couple of days, but it did also say, quote, ICE is redoubling its efforts to work with local and state officials and NGO partners in the area so they are prepared to provide assistance with transportation or other services. Now, Tammy, it's not clear whether the lack of communication between ICE and the shelter organizations is being affected by the government shutdown, but it is worth noting that many ICE staff deemed non-essential are not working right now. Tammy?
Yeah, well, Jonathan, thank you. At the same time, wouldn't you agree, though, that certainly the Customs and Border Patrol is swamped and that ICE is swamped? We've got, they're releasing hundreds right now into El Paso, but we're dealing with thousands of people who clearly they're releasing them based on the Family Separation Act, that they are just overwhelmed at this point, regardless of...
Yeah. You're absolutely right, Tammy. You talk to any agents who work border area, and that is exactly the kind of word that they would use, that they are overwhelmed. One other point that I think is interesting, it's not at all clear that all of these who've been released in El Paso were asylum seekers. Some of them may simply have been illegal immigrants.
Right.
That points to catch and release taking place. That, of course, is something that President Trump says it doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, so obviously
Tammy?
more work to do. Great. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for that report. Now, Chris Kobach is the Kansas Secretary of State. He joins us now. Chris, you are a man. You know, you've been working on this for quite some time, for years. You know what the situation is. This is not unfamiliar to you either. Can you give us a sense, really, as people might want to blame the shutdown, but this is really chaos that is unfolding, and an overwhelmed Customs and Border Protection Force, overwhelmed ICE perhaps, because they're contained, if you will, by certain court decisions about what they can and cannot do. What do you think is going on in El Paso now, and should the people there be concerned about what's happening?
Well, first of all, you're correct when you suggest this is not because of the government shutdown. Enforcement and removal operations of ICE, that's the division that handles this type of duty, they're essential employees. They're working at full steam regardless of the shutdown. There might be some public affairs officers who normally, contact the press and things like that who might not be working, but it's not caused by the shutdown. Secondly, although the numbers this week in El Paso are large and larger than normal, people should be aware that there are, if you look nationally, thousands of people being released into the United States who are asylum seekers, not necessarily worthy of asylum, but claiming that they are, every month. And so this is a big problem. Here, this number should shock you. In the last 5 years, the number of asylum claims in the United States system has gone up 2,000%. There are almost 800,000 asylum cases pending in our immigration courts. And the vast majority of those are not legitimate. It's estimated that these Central American claims, well over 90%, are going to be denied. They're not even close to being a legitimate claim of asylum. Asylum requires that your government back home is persecuting you, and you have a well-founded fear of being hurt because of your membership in a particular social group. Whereas these people are coming in saying, well, I've got gangs in my neighborhood. And so this asylum loophole has become a massive loophole that is causing a huge problem for the whole system. So it is a big problem. This is just a symptom.
And we're letting these people out, of course, presuming they'll come back. This is the old game to get their court hearing, and then they just never show up. But we also learned a couple weeks ago from Secretary Nielsen of the Department of Homeland Security that we have an arrangement with Mexico now that they would hold people who are looking for asylum until we can adjudicate them. Do you think that's really going to happen, or do you think that we're still is the president still going to have to go and try to get this done through the courts, which clearly seem to be resistant to him being able to control the border?
Well, a little of both. So I think that what Secretary Nielsen announced last week is a big first. It's not a first step. It's a big step in the right direction for those people who haven't yet crossed into the United States. But most of the people we're talking about here in El Paso, they were already in the United States when they were apprehended, many of them anyway. And for those people, what DHS needs to do right away is to finalize a proposed regulation that they promulgated back in September. And that regulation will override what's called the Flores settlement, which is why we're releasing all these people, and allow the detention of complete family units together until their case is adjudicated finally.
Chris,
and we've got to get that done right away, and there's no time to waste.
Yeah, because that's the question. What do we do next? And that's a great point. Thank you, sir, for joining us. I appreciate it. Have a great night.
My pleasure.
Now, in the meantime, Defense Secretary Mattis is leaving the administration early. Washington elites are panicking, but could his departure be a good thing? That's next. After resigning last week, Defense Secretary James Mattis was supposed to stay on the job through February, but on Sunday, President Trump announced that he's removing Mattis early and will replace him with Deputy Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan beginning January 1st. That's coming right up. Mattis's impending departure has Washington fixtures like Bob Woodward in a panic.
It's a governing crisis. You have the exit of Mattis, which is a tragedy for the country, a tragedy for President Trump. Mattis was able to thread the needle and try to make his points and, quite frankly, educate President Trump on some of these issues. And so the departure of him is something that is, I think, going down in the history books.
Well, Christian Whiten is a former State Department senior advisor to Trump and George W. Bush administrations. He joins us now. Christian, I really don't recall Woodward saying that when Barack Obama fired Mattis that was a tragedy. Did I miss that part? I didn't miss that, did I?
The pearl clutching really has gotten out of control. I mean, Mattis did what he was supposed to do, which is kill ISIS. That was the urgent crisis. That's what needed to be done. That's what Donald Trump promised to do. And he did it. He did a masterful job. He helped unlock the power of our forces in Syria, get the lawyers out of the way and let our soldiers do their job. But Mattis was opposed to Trump on most other things. He wanted to stay in the Paris climate boondoggle. He opposed moving the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. He opposed getting the Iran deal. He didn't want to send troops to the border. So what President Trump deserves and what he ought to get is someone who actually is on board with the Trump agenda. And that's what Bob Woodward doesn't like.
Yeah, you've got a great piece at foxnews.com. It's gone kind of viral about why him leaving is a good thing. There are many things you lay out in your piece. At the same time, I was struck with the pettiness of his resignation letter, if you will, that he would still be the Secretary of Defense, that he's still talking about the Commander-in-Chief, and yet he messages that he doesn't like what the Commander-in-Chief is doing. You know, I'm not surprised that the President asked him to leave early, because why would you do that? It would have a morale effect on the troops, on the other people in the Pentagon. How could he justify that, considering his position? And that he's talking, say whatever you want once you're out of office. But that seemed to be, at least to me, surprising. Did it surprise you, or was this something that he's known for being a little problematic like that?
No, it did strike me as odd. It struck me as odd he led with sort of complaints that we were not being kind enough to our NATO allies. That's another thing Mattis was against, what the president has done, which is to insist that NATO fulfill the pledges it has made to spend a measly 2%. They're not even close. Germany is at 1.3%, and our friends up in Canada at 1% of GDP. That's all they spend, so we get the privilege of defending them. They screw us on trade. They are, in Germany, generating fake news, anti-American propaganda against us, and we have to defend them. What Donald Trump did was say, hey, you got to spend your fair share. Mattis was opposed to that, and his resignation letter said, he sort of brought this back up again. Well, look,
at the same time, it's a signal of respect that you want your allies and your friends to be able to support themselves if something happened. There could be nothing worse in the world that if our friends and allies are unprepared for something to happen, when we might not be able to manage the entire world, if there was a black swan of some major nuclear event, it's something that you would want your friends and your family to say, which is, you've got to help us. You've got to be able to stand on your own 2 feet to some degree in order for this to be able to work out. And that seems to be, of course, the president's approach. At the same time now, who do you think should replace him? Because that's got to be obviously a question everybody's asking. Who's next?
I think it should be someone political. Not that the Secretary of Defense should get into partisan political spats, but someone who can implement what Trump wants to do. He's drawn down in Syria. There's talk of drawing down in Afghanistan, which makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know what we're going to accomplish in another year or two that we haven't accomplished in 17 years. And if you add Afghanistan to Iraq and Syria, that's $60 billion a year. That's real money you could either save or you could spend rebuilding our Air Force and Navy and missiles and Space Force to deter China. And that's the the type of Secretary of Defense he
well,
needs.
It's a political position. It really is. I mean, no, understanding the military, understanding what's going on the ground is key. So having a general is fabulous, but ultimately it really is about being a negotiator, being a politician, understanding what needs to be accomplished. And I think obviously the president is finding that out. Christian, great piece at FoxNews.com, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Tammy. Appreciate it.
Well, the Women's March movement is falling apart over accusations of anti-Semitism and ties to Louis Farrakhan. We'll talk about that next. The Dow Jones average surged more than 1,000 points today. That's the biggest single-day increase ever, you guys, and offset some steep drops the market just saw just before the holiday. Meanwhile, the White House assured that Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell and Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin's jobs are safe, despite a recent tweet where President Trump complained about the Federal Reserve hiking interest rates, a legitimate complaint, according to many people. Heather Zumaraga is a financial analyst. In the midst of all of this, she joins us. Thanks for joining us, Heather.
Hi, Tammy.
Hi. Look, it's been for somebody who does what you do, other than people who, a lot of people I hear from on Twitter and social media saying they just can't look at their 401k or their Roth statement. They just aren't going to look at it for a while. This really has got to be exciting in a certain sense of getting a sense of what this really means. What's your take on this kind of volatility and why it's happening right now?
Well, this is very unnerving if you're an average investor in the marketplace right now. 1,000-point advance in the Dow has never been seen in history. And yeah, this is coming on the backs, though, of the largest decline on Christmas Eve that we've ever seen. We had over 600-point decline on the Dow. And for Christmas Eve, we haven't ever seen that before. That's not a way to rein in the new year and for Santa to come in bearing gifts. But look, the markets are up for a few reasons. We have certainty over Fed Chair Jay Powell's job. Kevin Hassett came out today and he said Fed Chair Jay Powell's job is secure as head of the U.S. Central Bank. And that's really important, Tammy, because the markets want stability. So we need to make sure Fed Chair Jay Powell and Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin will keep their jobs. And I think they will.
Well, look, and I think it's interesting in that for 8 years of Barack Obama, we were pretty much at zero at a rate. It was almost like keeping the economy on life support in a sense. There was no real action. Now we've got Donald Trump where there is activity. Right? It's like you've come out of a coma and things can be a little unnerving and a little surprising sometimes, but that's what happens with action. At the same time, he had been talking about tariffs, dealing with China, dealing with trade issues. That had been something he talked about during the campaign. So a lot of people felt that was baked into the market with the extraordinary surge that we had starting with his, with January of 2017. In fact, this can happen, or at least can withstand some volatility because of the strength that the market is in. The fundamentals are strong, right? We've seen this incredible retail surge with purchasing over the holiday. Wouldn't you say that, in fact, this is just kind of a sign of activity and well, the nation coming back to life economically?
It really is, Tammy. Look, the fundamentals are still strong. Unemployment at 50-year lows. Retail sales data that we're getting today is showing that the consumer is out in full stride. That's 2/3 of the economy. And even if GDP is slowing down a little bit, we're still growing at 3.4% GDP growth in the economy. And that's far better than under President Barack Obama's 8-year, 10-year averaging 1.8%.
Yeah, well, we've all got our hands full. The president clearly is working very hard, and we'll see where things go next. But it looks good so far. Was a great day. Thanks for joining us, Heather. I appreciate it.
Sure.
All right, you guys, the Women's March movement was supposed to bring down the president, the Trump administration. Instead, it may not survive to the second anniversary of his inauguration. Leaders of the group are facing growing accusations of anti-Semitism and attacks for their ties to Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan. Activist Linda Sarsour recently denied ever having met Farrakhan, although she spoke alongside him at an event in 2015. Cracks are showing today. The Chicago branch of the Women's March said it will not be holding a rally this January. Ellie Beth Stuckey is a podcast host. She joins us now. Allie, how are you? Thanks for coming on.
I'm doing well. Thanks, Tammy.
Look, we've been hearing about this for a while. It's been very, very public. We know that one of the founders, a woman who lives in Hawaii, who started this movement with a Facebook post, was the first one to come out and say, look, this is not what we stand for. There needs to be a change in leadership because, in a way, she's argued it's been hijacked. And now we see this continuing. There's supposed to be a big event in January. Where do you think all of this is heading at this point?
Well, look, Perez, Sarsour, and Mallory, three of the organization's founders, have been running away from these accusations of anti-Semitism really since the beginning of the founding of the Women's March, and they are unable to escape them. And the reason for that is because of their association with Louis Farrakhan, who, as we know, speaks of the Jewish people in subhuman terms, talks about how Jews are satanic, they're really the enemy of the people. Mallory, in particular, has been a very big and public fan of Louis Farrakhan. And also the tablet expose that just came out that cited some of the very troubling anti-Semitic comments that they made when the organization was founded, talking about the Jewish people's role in white supremacy and oppression of the black people. And so going forward with more of this information coming out, women of color and other people in the organization saying, hey, this is not okay, I'm just not sure that the Women's March can survive.
Well, when I was on the left, we were always aware of people on the far left, or people who did not mean our movement well, were trying to hijack certain things we were doing. And if you had experience, you would know what to watch for. Clearly something happened here that while, of course, all issues are women's issues, what we don't do and what we don't embrace, certainly, I don't think any American of decency embraces racism or Jew hatred. I don't know how difficult is it to disavow Louis Farrakhan, which they have not been able to do. You know, this sends a message that really has nothing to do with women's rights or women's lives or the welfare of women at all. And it really does kind of damage that many women were looking to this march or to this movement to speak for them. But Allie, we also saw some division when the march refused to embrace or allow pro-life women to join them in that march. So it was really very political from the beginning when it comes to liberalism or left-wing politics versus women's welfare.
Right. And while I disagree with much of the politics, if not all of the politics of the Women's March, I do stand by their right to peacefully protest behind leaders that they can trust and actually tout the organization's values. And while, like I said, I don't agree with them, they do say that they are for tolerance, they are for inclusion, they are for, like you said, women's empowerment and women's rights. But I don't see how it is actually for those things if they don't include pro-life women, if they don't include Jewish women, or they don't treat Jewish women the same. But this is the insanity of intersectionality, this oppression
and identity
that
politics.
we're seeing from the far left.
You know, it is.
Exactly.
It's the issue of identity politics.
Even the left.
Yeah, you know, and this is where it gets off center here. I'm the president of Independent Women's Voice. There's also, though, at this march in Washington, there's going to be a number of different counter-protests, if you will, including from the IW groups, really making it clear that all women matter, right? Whether you're Jewish or not, or Christian, it transcends religion, it transcends race, it transcends ethnicity, economics. This is what makes us sisters, and yet we don't even still have that conversation when this movement, as it was being seen or described as being the epitome of a movement. So we'll find out. This is an important thing to discuss, and American people are going to be able to make their decision. Thank you, Allie, for joining us tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tammy.
All right. This is a Fox News alert. President Trump is now in Germany, visiting U.S. troops at Ramstein Air Force Base. The president is on his way back from Iraq, as you know, where he met with our troops there earlier today. Great, looking great right there. And next, is socialism coming back in America? Tucker returns after the break to investigate that question. Coming up next.